Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host,
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, we're back again with another video. If you didn't catch our last one, we did a live one together. So check that out if you're interested. Had a lot to talk about. But in this episode, we're going to go over some things that have happened over the last couple of days, including the NBA Cup. So we had some really strong NBA Cup games once again, as we've talked about the NBA Cup. It feels like it's kind of lost a little bit of its luster since its induction. But the main thing is that all these games do count, and a lot of them are super competitive. So probably not going to touch on every single game just because there's not really much of a need. But there were some really fun ones that I thought, were kind of worth mentioning. So I guess we can start off with the Lakers and the Grizzlies. Might as well, because that was, because you had two quote unquote national games, right? The Amazon Prime matchups, right? Lakers, Grizzlies, Celtics, Sixers. And, this Lakers one, right? Luka came back from his injury, right? He had been out for a few games, a couple of games, right? Due to a finger sprain and a leg contusion. And he's supposed to be reevaluated in a week. It didn't feel like it was a week, right? I think it was maybe just shy of it. But he came back, and in his return, he had 44 points, 12 rebounds, 6 assists, 6 of 15 from 3, which is 40%. And it's kind of funny. This was a very strange game, right? So through the first 3 games he's played, he's averaging 45, 12, and 8, which is already insane. I believe that's the best 3-game start to a season since Wilt. So you're in historical territory. But with Luka out, and also keep in mind LeBron's been out. He hasn't played at all, right? You did have a few games where Austin Reeves kind of had to play the role of superstar, and he actually was able to do that. They were 2-1 while Luka was out, including the game winner against the Wolves, right, where he drives and splits, between Gobert and Conley, or DiVincenzo, I think. And then he gets the floater. DiVincenzo tries to take the charge. It goes right down the net. They win by 1 because they were up big for most of that game. But then in this game, Smart and Luka come back. They both start. And it's kind of funny watching this game, right? Because the Lakers are 4-2, and that's with, like I said, LeBron not having played at all, Luka having missed a few games, had some role players be in and out of the lineup as well. And, the Grizzlies going into this game had the same record, right? And so the Grizzlies think we're a team that most of us, I had the over on them, but I think most people were lower on because of the Bane trade, but also the injuries too. That hasn't helped because they've had injuries to backup guards and a bunch of their front court guys. And so this was going to be a game where you kind of see, what does this look like? And the Lakers had the edge for a decent chunk of the first half. Then the Grizzlies in the second quarter went on this massive run, right, where they outscored the Lakers in the second quarter by 20 points. And the Lakers were down 15 at halftime. Then in the third quarter, Luka takes the game over. DeAndre Ayton doesn't play at all in the second half. Apparently had back spasms, which we didn't know about until the fourth. Didn't know what was going on there. But just a super impressive game from everybody. And it's funny because when you watch Luka play, it didn't feel like he had a great game, and it felt like there was an adjustment period because they went from having the ball in Austin's hands to all of a sudden now it's in Luka's hands. And there were stretches where he was dominating the ball, going one-on-one, and hey, it was working, but there were some stretches where he had some turnovers, took some forced shots, and Reeves was not in as strong of a rhythm as he was through the first few games. But then in the second half, he figured it out. He didn't shoot the ball well, but still got to the line a ton. Finished as a plus 15 on the night. So pretty good game all around. And you do kind of wonder what it looks like with LeBron back because, I know plus net rating wise, Luka and Austin together were plus 6.5. Without LeBron, they were plus 12.7. So basically double, right? When those two guys were together, when all three were together, they were basically net rating of 0. So when the three of them were together, it wasn't as great. So a lot of the better lineups were when all three were not on the floor. And some of it just depended on who they played with. But now you have a guy in Ayton where he didn't have a great game in this one, but by and large, he's been really good for them. Marcus Smart, same thing. Jake LaRavia, slow start to the season, but he's been much better. He had 27 in the game against the Wolves. So a lot of really good performances there. And then on the Grizzlies side, a very strange game. This was a strange game in general, but just, when you look at the stat line, right? Like, if you're kind of thinking about what the Grizzlies would need to do in this game, it's like, okay, you need Jaren Jackson Jr. to be really good. then you probably need some good performances from some of the role players. He got some role player performances. Jock Landale had 16 points, 5 rebounds. KCP, who's actually played pretty well for the Grizzlies so far this season, right? Having a bounce back a year after really struggling in Orlando. Jalen Wells, right, didn't shoot well, but had his moments. And then even off the bench, Cedric Coward, who's been great, fantastic as a rookie, right, one of the better rookies in the class on both ends of the floor. He came to play. But then you look at Jaren Jackson Jr., especially Ja, right? This was a really bad game from Ja, and one where it was particularly concerning. He had 7 points. Or excuse me, wrong stat line. That's Santi Aldama. He had 8 points. 7 assists, 3 for 14, 0 for 6 from 3. He cannot hit a 3 this season. And if you actually watched him play, he was just floating. He was basically not doing much of anything. Like, there were a lot of possessions where he didn't even want to be involved on the offensive end of the floor, just kind of standing around, not really making a decision to cut or do anything. And then on defense, basically a turnstile there as well, right? Wasn't really competing on that end either. After the game, they asked him what was going on, and he said basically, quote, talk to the coaching staff. So I don't know what was going on there. I don't know if something was said. I don't know if something personal happened, but it was a really bad game from him. Not, like I said, not just in terms of counting stats, but just in terms of he looked like he just didn't even want to be there. Jaren Jackson Jr. fouled out, so not an amazing game from him either. I guess he was better than Ja for sure, but neither guy really played great. So you would have needed both of those guys to be really good in order to win. And when you get outplayed by Luka, not amazing. So, and it's weird because the Grizzlies' record, I mean, they're 500 with a bunch of guys out. Going into that game, they were 3-2. So it doesn't feel like it should be as disastrous as it looked, but it just didn't look great. And then, like I said, on the other end for the Lakers, right, they've been, their vibes have been really fantastic where, they have a winning record, even with a bunch of guys out. I know their schedule hasn't been insanely tough, but they've also been really shorthanded. And they're winning games that they may not have won in previous seasons. So, all around, really good game from Luka and the staff in LA. But in Memphis, kind of concerning, kind of alarming, I would say, because that's to be 6 games in and already have issues with that, especially with the coach Taylor Jenkins being fired last year. It's just not a good look, specifically from Ja. And on the broadcast, right, Blake Griffin on the Amazon broadcast kind of was calling out Ja, right? Not necessarily in a disrespectful or mean way, but he was kind of saying like, yeah, when you're the superstar and you're getting paid, all this money, you can't have games, and performances and mindsets like that. And, he's kind of saying it like he's rooting for Ja, but it just didn't really look good there. So I don't know what's going to happen, but that was not great.
Yeah.
That was really good.
Yeah, shout out to LA because I think a lot they had a lot of doubters. I think once they heard that LeBron was going to be out for an extended period of time, we were more on the mindset of okay, well it's kind of Luka time, right? And he's kind of showing us exactly proving our point pretty much, right? Like yes, he missed time, but for his return to drop 44, 44. And 12 is pretty wild, right? And very efficient and very good. Just kind of picking up where he left off from, but just proving furthermore that this is really his team, going forward, and he's that guy. And then Austin Reeves also carrying the load as well with Luka being out, right? Like we've seen him have some great performances prior to this game, but even in this game, right, you talked about it, wasn't necessarily a standout performance, but still enough to get the job done. And that's kind of what you would want from him, especially considering who else is on this roster. But LA seems to have found a nice little rhythm here, and inserting Luka back into the lineup is definitely a plus. That doesn't really take anything away from what they were doing prior to. But yeah, I think the story really outside of the Luka 40-point game is definitely the Memphis Grizzlies and their woes, right? They're kind of a deep roster. Granted, there are some injuries here and there, right? You do have some bright spots, like you said, with Cedric Coward, and the other guys like the role players. But I think when your stars just don't show up and they don't perform at the level that you would expect them to, and at the level that we know that they can, play ball at, I think it is kind of disheartening, right? Like we're talking about Jaren Jackson Jr. This is a guy who is a very good defender, but fouled out in this game. So by and large, that's a pretty bad game from him. And then Ja Morant, obviously, we know that he can be a hub and an offensive-minded guy, but when he's not showing up on the offensive end, what are you really getting, right? I mean, yeah, he had some good passes, some good, playmaking plays here and there. But, offensively, we want to see him score. We want to see him put the ball in the hoop, and he really just couldn't do that. So I think there are some valid questions about this team. And yeah, I don't know what they kind of do going forward because they clearly don't have the offensive firepower, I think, to keep up in a Western Conference like this.
Yeah, I think you kind of just have to wait for some of these other guys to come back because, they are without, their front court guys. So, they're kind of small after Jaren Jackson Jr., right? No Edey, no Brandon Clark. And then they're backup guards, right? So, like, even when Ja's off the floor, right? Like, you need, somebody to kind of keep the offense humming on the perimeter. No Ty Jerome, no Scottie Pippen Jr., and those guys aren't coming back anytime soon. Especially, I think Scottie Pippen Jr. is going to be out for at least a couple more months. So, that's kind of a tough spot to be in. Like you said, they do have a lot of depth, but that's probably all you can realistically do. And until then, you're going to have Jaren Jackson Jr. and Ja probably just play up a level, relative to what we normally see from them, because that's kind of one of the only ways you can really make up for it. Like you said, they have some other guys off the bench who can help, but you still need more. And so we'll just have to kind of see where it goes from there. I'm not expecting Ja to get traded. I think Memphis still believes in him, and both the organization and the fan base. It wasn't a good look last night, so I'm hoping that that's kind of just a one-off thing. But you just never know.
Yeah.
With that team, where it just kind of feels like they've just kind of been in this weird situation. But at least it seems like the Bane trade, has kind of worked out for them in the sense of like they're gonna get a really good pick, regardless of what happens with them. And then obviously. I don't think Howard was part of that trade, right? But well, I guess he was because that was the Magic pick, right? So
yeah, technically, yeah, yeah.
So you got Cedric Howard, and then you got the future pick from either Washington or Phoenix. So in a way, they kind of worked out, and with the way, especially with the way that the Magic have looked so far. So we'll see. I think they can be better when they get their guys back, but like I said, I'm just keeping my eye on that situation, and then. Just back to the Lakers, like the thing with Luka is compared to last season in LA, right? The burst, right? Just the ability for him to get to certain spots. He can actually get past some defenders now, and he's not running out of gas in the second half like we saw in some of the games last year where he'd have these ridiculous first halves, and then in the second half, he would kind of just disappear and not really do a whole lot on the offensive end. And so you're going to need that while LeBron is out. And like I said, I'm super curious and excited to see what it looks like whenever LeBron comes back, which is supposed to be within the next few weeks.
Right.
Just because, you're bringing in a guy who is super versatile on both ends of the floor, but obviously at 40-41, what is he going to give you every night, right? Because, I mean, last year, right before he got hurt, he was, playing like one of the best players in the league. He finished second team All-NBA. So as long as there's no real significant drop-off, it should be a net positive. But, in fairness, last year when the three of them were together, the net rating was basically even. So it wasn't really like a dominant group. But that's where I think you hope that some of these new players like Ayton, Marcus Smart can kind of help out, which they have by and large. Those guys have been real positives for them. Even a guy like a Laravia, right, where, like, we thought it was a okay, decent signing, but you didn't necessarily know what you were going to get since he's such a young player. But, in the last few games, when they've needed somebody to step up, he's been there. And even, Jared Vanderbilt has given them some decent minutes at stretches, right? Sometimes it can get kind of clunky offensively, but especially, when they try to run small with him as like a small ball center, it's actually worked for them. So, I like a lot of the pieces on this team. As we've said, they still, regardless, probably need some type of transaction to get them closer. But it feels like that there's a decent framework there for a really good team, right?
Yeah.
This is one of the teams I was a little bit higher on. Sounds a little bit homerish, but just I was kind of banking on new and improved Luka plus some good roster additions, but still a lot of time left in the season, so we'll have to see where it continues.
Yeah.
Moving on, we did have the Celtics and the Sixers play. The Celtics won 109-108. They were up by 20 points at one point in this game, and then it got ugly for them really quickly, but they were able to hang on with Jaylen Brown leading the way. He had 32 points, kind of trying to put on a Jason Tatum impression that you weren't really quite sure if you were going to get that from him, right? And so far, honestly, I think you have gotten that from him, right? He's giving you 28, 5, and 4, so he's giving you some rebounding, giving you some playmaking, while also giving you the scoring and the versatility on both ends of the floor. You've gotten some good performances from some of these other guys. Minot didn't shoot well, but he's had some good performances for them. Peyton Pritchard and Derek White as the guards, Keita as the starting center, and then even off the bench, like Luka Garza, you've gotten good minutes from him. Anthony Simons took 21 shots, 7 for 21, but overall has been like a net positive for them. Even the rookie Hugo Gonzalez, right, has come in and has given them a burst of energy. So there kind of is a decent amount to like here, to the degree where I don't think we expected them to tank necessarily. I think we were kind of thinking that this is a gap year. It just kind of depends on, like, well, if some guys start getting hurt, like say the Pacers, then it's going to get dark pretty quickly. But there's some interesting things here where you do kind of wonder what it looks like with Tatum back. I'm not sure how sustainable it's all going to be, but there are some pieces where, like, you could see them potentially as like future pieces, maybe off the bench or something like that. Like a Minot or a Luka Garza. And then from the Sixer side, right? I mean, they lost this game, but they're 4-1. They were undefeated going into this game. Big part of that is due to the play from the backcourt, right? Obviously, Embiid has been back and he's been playing, albeit on a minutes restriction. But now you've gotten some offensive juice and firepower from guys like Maxey and Edgecombe, right? Maxey's seemingly gone up a level. Edgecombe's been fantastic as a rookie. Even Oubre has given you some really strong production on both ends of the floor. He's actually been one of the handful of bright spots for them the last couple of years when it's been kind of rough. Mm-hmm. And then even off the bench, right? Quentin Grimes, Adem Bona, right? All these other guys that are just, out there contributing and playing with a ton of energy. Kind of like this team. The main thing is defensively, they've not been very good. We saw them in person when they played the Washington Wizards, and they did come back and win the game. But it is funny because they can score, and the guards can play at a super fast pace. But this team defensively has had some unique stretches. I mean, in this game, they held the Celtics to, they didn't win, but, it was 109. But just in general, even like with Embiid, he can still score, but it just feels like defensively, he doesn't really move a whole lot. I mean, he had 2 blocks, and, I think the hope is as his minutes go up and as, he feels better, you'll get closer, to whatever you get from him. But it does feel like if they're actually going to be really good, he's going to have to be, like two-way Joel Embiid. It can't just be I can still score 25 plus in my sleep.
Right.
But defensively now I'm kind of just average or, maybe even below average. They do have a lot of athletes on this team, but it feels like it would be nice if you had a little bit, more size in terms of some of the fours, right? Because it's really Trent and Watford. They're starting Jabari Walker, and it just would be nice to have some people that are a little bit better. But, again, with the way that the guards have played, I mean, the 3-headed monster of the backcourt guys, and then eventually Jared McCain will come back. So that's the other part that you have to factor in as well, right? There's the makings of a good team in here. It's just, again, and we haven't even talked about Paul George hasn't played. So, the main question is the health of Embiid, right? Because, like I said, he's on a minutes restriction, and if he can get closer to what we've seen from him, if he can be anywhere close, like this is a really good team. But I do kind of worry defensively because it feels like that's the part that's been, even though they've won, they've had to come back from big deficits every game. And I don't think that that's sustainable. That's something that you shouldn't have to do in order to win games. And I think that's because of the defense. So if the defense can improve, which, I think, you would hope, with George coming back and Embiid, maybe amping it up, it could improve. But, you still need a few other guys at a couple other positions to probably help. But just like I said, Maxey taking it up a level. If this is like who he is, that that's a check. That's a box that you have to check. Edgecombe being ready out of the gates, that's a box that you have to check. So there's a lot here that I do like, even though they lost the game. And like I said, from the Celtics perspective, there's some good things there too.
Yeah, I think the Philly narrative part of this probably outweighs the Celtics, even though Celtics did win this game, and shout out to them because I think they do need every single win they could possibly get here. It's just kind of, their season's been kind of weird, right? Kind of expected, I guess, right? Like we knew that they were kind of coming into this season without like a certified big man, right? And I think that's the problem. Obviously, having no Tatum is the glaring issue here. But like you said, Jaylen Brown did a great job specifically in this game and throughout the season has been, putting on his little Tatum cape, which I think is pretty cool, right? And you have guys like Peyton Pritchard who are playing decent, Derek White as well. And then Simon's coming off the bench. I think that was to be expected, but it hasn't necessarily, I don't think, been, perfect, but I think there have been some bright spots there, right, in terms of, the scoring and the volume, which they need because they're not really going to get it elsewhere on the roster, right? So shout out to the Celtics for actually staying afloat. I thought they were going to be a little bit worse at this point in the season already than what they are now. So
Three.
yeah, exactly. So shout out to them, and shout out to them for getting this win. But like with Philly, yeah, like you said, we saw them play IRL. There are some issues, especially on the defensive end, right? Like I think Bona is pretty good. Like we saw him get a lot of blocks, and we've been seeing him get blocks throughout the regular season so far. But offensively, very one dimensional. Can't really shoot, so you can't really ask him to play the four or even really start in some cases. I think with Philly, right? Because solid backup big man, but I think there is a clear limitation to his game on both ends of the floor. And like you said, the other fours, I guess, on the team would be like a Trendon Watford. I mean, like that's okay. Offensively, I think he's fine, but defensively, not really one of those kind of guys. So I guess you kind of are waiting on, I guess, Paul George to come back, and then you can kind of slot somebody else down. Maybe, I don't know, but yeah. And Embiid, like you literally told me in person, like yeah, he's not moving, like he's not shuffling his feet. It doesn't look good, and we saw what happened when Sarr, in the Wizards game was kind of putting the press on Embiid, right? Like there were times when Embiid might get one stop, but then the second chance effort isn't really there just because he's not really moving, like he used to, and then Sarr would get an easy 2 points. That's kind of what you saw in this Boston game, right? So defensively there are some woes, but like you said, offensively Philly's really been on fire, and I think they've been one of the bigger surprises of the season, right? We all knew Maxey was good, but I don't think we expected him to be this good this season. And then Edgecombe as well, we knew that he was going to be a very good rookie, but not arguably the best right now. So shout out to Philly. I think this was a winnable game. They kind of just didn't come out of the gate punching as much. I think Boston wanted it a little bit more. But, yeah, Philly's still a great team at the moment. And I think the trajectory for them, honestly, is probably going to be on the up and up as long as they continue to, get guys back and, stay healthy.
Yeah, exactly. I think that you can be even better. Because, like I said, as long as Embiid continues to physically improve, then that'll help. Paul George, he's an older guy, so how much does he have left? But, he could be better than the fours that they're playing, even though he's not a four either,
Sure.
right? But just in terms of talent, right, that might help, kind of fix some issues there. And he'll have to probably get used to doing some more of the little things because they have so many other guys. And I don't know if he's going to do that. So that's kind of a question there, but you can't really trade him because of the contract. So
Sure.
you're kind of stuck with it. You're gonna have to find a way to make it work. So this team becomes one of the more intriguing teams in the conference and in the league, just because we talked about it going into the season where we don't know how many games we're gonna get with those two guys. Embiid has played by and large, right? I think there was one back-to-back game that he didn't play because he didn't play the one before the Wizards game. But he's played. He's been on a minutes restriction, and again, offensively, he's still putting up numbers. So the talent and the skill is still there. It's just a matter of can they figure things out defensively, so that way they don't have to come back from big deficits every game. Because like I said, I just don't think that part is sustainable. And I think it's fixable with some of it, and then some of it they may just have to decide like maybe we have to make some trades and kind of swap some guys around. So I think they'll have the option to do that. Once they can kind of evaluate some of the other players on the roster. So I kind of like this team. It's just a matter of how much better could they actually be.
Right.
Then moving on, we did have a couple other games in this cup stretch that we might as well cover. So the Knicks and the Bulls won 135-125. So the Bulls now improved to 5-0, still undefeated. And the Knicks dropped to 2-3. And when you look at the Bulls, we kind of talked about them already, where you're just getting solid all-around contributions from a bunch of guys like Josh Giddey. Like Kobe White hasn't played at all because he had the calf injury.
Mm-hmm.
But Josh Giddey has come in and he's been really good for them, right? Basically averaging 22, 9, and 8 in terms of the three-point shot, right? How is that looking? This season, he's shooting 43% from three, right? Only on 3.5 attempts a game. Not shooting free throws great, but he is getting to the line a lot. And still kind of providing, the all-around offensive game, right, in terms of like the passing, the rebounding, the transition play. So they were lighting up the Knicks. I mean, they won by 10, but they were up by bigger than that for a decent chunk of the game. Trey Jones in the backcourt right? Kind of providing like he didn't do a whole lot offensively in this game, although he got to the line 8 times, but providing like a defensive minded hustle type of scrappy point guard next to Giddy. So that's pretty helpful, right? That's not really what Kobe White is. He's more of a scorer.
Hmm.
Isaac Okoro, kind of a slow start, but he is, he starts, he's out there. Buzelis, right, obviously has given them really good production and energy. And Vucevic, still playing really strong basketball, even at this age. He was in trade rumors, hasn't been traded. I do kind of wonder if he actually does get moved, but I mean, if you're the Bulls, you're winning games. So, I mean, I guess you see what that looks like as you get closer to the deadline. And then even off the bench, right? Kevin Herter, Patrick Williams, Io DeSunmu, Jalen Smith. So just contributions all around. They play up and down. They play really fast, and it's the type of team that feels like is a problem for the Knicks, right? If a team can get out and run, it's not been great for them, right? Where it's kind of hard for them to get back in transition, which was a problem last year, right? Where they had an issue with teams that could run out and just get easy baskets on the break because they don't have a lot of those type of guys, right? I mean, when you're looking at their starters, right? Brunson and Towns, you're not really getting that from them. This is Mitchell Robinson's first game back, right? So, obviously he has to get his legs under him. And then you look at the bench, still not really been great. So it's still early, but for the team that we picked to make it out of the East, it's been kind of a disappointing, in my opinion, stretch for them, where it just feels like they could and should be better. Maybe they're kind of figuring out which guys to roll around with, but it still feels like functionally there's some kinks that are going to have to be ironed out. Especially against these, and they may just have a weakness against these type of teams, but I do feel like it's got to be better. On especially on the defensive end. Like, I mean, just in this game, like I said, they were getting ran out of the gym. I guess if we want to look at their team stats, so far this season, and kind of look at their net ratings and whatnot, right? Offensively, right? Where do they rank? They rank 17th. So offensively, they haven't been great. And then defensively, they're 14th. So pretty much average on both ends of the floor. And that shouldn't be the case for the Knicks going into this season so far, right? Especially because there were a couple, like say the Bucks game, right? Like they had a 12-point lead in the first half. And I know Towns, maybe he's just banged up. So maybe it's just some guys aren't 100% and they don't have a very deep team. And so that's just kind of impacting everything. But I would like to see some fixes there. So, and we'll see if it's doable with the roster they have, or maybe they just kind of have to, like I said, configure some other guys around. Because it's been kind of a letdown, I would say, for the team that was kind of looked at to be, along with Cleveland, a favorite in the Eastern Conference, and they have not played like it through the first 5 games.
Absolutely. I think the big story here for me personally is Chicago. Obviously, New York is a much bigger market. There are probably more stakes riding on that team, being successful, right? Especially even for us personally, right? For us, picking New York to come out of the East, right? But, with Chicago, shout out to them. I love what they're doing, right? Like the ball movement, and Josh Giddey, low-key turning into one of the better hubs in the NBA, right? Like you can really run your offense through this guy, right? Especially, now that he's been able to actually, knock down a jumper, right? So now you're kind of seeing the full potential of what, he could be, outside of, what we thought he could be in Oklahoma City, right? So, shout out to him for, finding guys in rhythm. It's been really special. And I think they have, the talent, or at least some of the pieces and talent, in Chicago to potentially go on a run. But is it sustainable? That's going to be the question, right? Like, is it a little bit of a hot start, or is it, legit, right? And that's where I think we kind of do need to wait on it a little bit. But the positives by far outweigh the negatives, right? You have guys off the bench who have been, performing and shooting lights out, like DeSunmu, Kevin Herter as well, right? Like it's not like a joke of a team, right? The team doesn't just end at the starting 5, and that's what I really like about this team. And they all have a role, and they've all been playing it and playing out of their minds, especially being 5-0. So that's pretty cool. And knocking out the Knicks, I think, is no small challenge or anything like that. So pretty dope. But for New York, it's like, what are they doing, right? I think there were a lot of changes, I think, from last year to this year. However, none that I think would warrant a start like this, right? There's tons of guys they brought in, especially for the bench depth, but I really haven't really felt it. It seems like we're getting shades of the bad version of this team last year, where you had a lot of question marks about what the guys outside of potentially Brunson and Towns would look like, right? They seem kind of spotty at times. The ball is moving amongst the starting five, but it's really just the bench woes again. And I'm not sure how you solved that because I think you brought in, talented players that were kind of supposed to, fix and bolster up that bench, right? You brought in a Yabusele, you brought in, a Jordan Clarkson. Josh Hart has been, slotted to the bench. So and then Deuce McBride, you kind of expected him to pick up from last year as well. So I'm not really sure. And then it also doesn't help that they have little to no young guys off the bench as well, right? And I think that's something Knicks fans are kind of pissed off about, right? Like Tyler Kolek, as much as a fan favorite as he is, I think among Knicks fans, they're kind of like, well, what does he really bring to the table? Bakome Dadier, like that guy doesn't really play. So I think there are some missing pieces on this team, even though I think they did have a pretty well put together offseason. We're just not really seeing them reap the rewards of that yet. Weird.
Yeah, and that's a good point that you kind of mentioned because like you said, we looked at the advanced stats and they can be kind of funky just because it's so few games into the season. But like you said, the ball in terms of how they're playing offensively, like you said, they're moving it around and guys are getting a bunch of touches. The shot spread is kind of what you'd expect, right? Like Mitchell Robinson's not going to get a bajillion shots, but 14 for Bridges, 14 for Towns, 13 for Anunoby in this game. But like you said, the bench is just kind of a problem. And they had Malcolm Brogdon and then he retired. And when you kind of look at him just in terms of name, he kind of ranked ahead of a couple of the guys like like a Clarkson or a Kolek. But now that you don't have him, like it's just kind of a bunch of different guys. But like you said, you don't really have that one specific guy off the bench that can kind of tie everything together and kind of connect all the pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that might just be missing. I'm not sure. Do you move Hart back into the starting five? I don't know. So
Potentially.
so that's kind of the question there. So they're gonna have to figure some stuff out because ideally you don't want to get off to a slow start like they are in the East, but like you said, the young players piece is kind of important because you look at some of these other teams, in the Eastern Conference, right? Like we mentioned the Bulls, right? Because that's a team that stands out with some of their younger players, but even outside them, like we talked about Philly with Edgecombe, Milwaukee, right? With guys like Ryan Rollins, right, and some of these other players that are just kind of coming in and giving them a bunch of production. The Heat, right, have a couple of guys, that fit that description. So even the Celtics, right, to a lesser extent. So it's only 5 games, and we know that through the first stretch of games in the season, things can be really strange.
Mm-hmm.
Just like in March in the NBA, where you have the stretch where like teams play at these levels where you're wondering like, is this real or is this not real? So I think it'll normalize eventually, but I didn't really expect them to get off to a slow start just because they're still bringing most of the guys from last year back. It is a different coach, but I don't know. It's kind of a disappointment. It's not the most disappointing one, but it is one that feels like a little bit of a letdown. But I'm not panicking necessarily yet.
Yeah.
Moving on to a couple of West Coast games, you also had the Nuggets and the Blazers, right? Where the Blazers beat the Nuggets 109-107, right? People mentioned some questionable calls with Kamara bear hugging Jokic, and Grant getting his way to the line. But the Blazers are 4-2, and they've actually had some pretty impressive wins against some teams, right? Like they blew out and just kind of outclassed Golden State. In fairness, Golden State's the second night of a back-to-back. They beat the Lakers. Obviously, that was a game where they were super shorthanded. And then they also take out this Nuggets team, right? Where, this is a team, I had them winning it all and coming out of the West, and Blazers were putting it to them. And when you look at this Portland array of guys, like, first off, shout out to Drew Holiday, right? Who's kind of had he didn't shoot well in this game, but by and large, he's been really helpful for them this season, right? On both ends of the floor, a connector piece. Obviously with Scoot Henderson out, you need somebody who can kind of, do some stuff offensively just as a manager. I know that's not really his role, but he had 13 assists in this game. He's done a good job of that, right? Shaden Sharp only played 24 minutes, interestingly, but he had 19. Klingon, right, continues to be a really impactful player, especially defensively. Shoots a lot of threes now.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of a unique part of the offense, right? Like I feel like that wasn't really part of what we were expecting
Nope.
from him on the offensive end, right? But still rebounding, still contesting shots, so he's still providing value. Tamani Kamara, which we've talked about, right? That's kind of a guy that a lot of, people who are deep into the league, right, really like and
Oh yeah.
appreciate, right? We both had him as all defense last year.
Yep.
Just, a really solid, impressive guy on both ends of the floor, can guard multiple positions. And he did that in this game, right? Denny Avdia, right? That's another kind of, NBA nerd favorite of players, right? Where he's had a really strong season, and in Portland, he's been very good,
Yeah.
right? Like they were closing the game small, and he was basically the center
Mm-hmm.
in that game. So a lot of really impressive contributions, and then Jeremy Grant being good off the bench, right? Didn't shoot well in this game, but he's actually had some strong moments. Robert Williams came back, right? He had some, he was going through conditioning, I think, so this was his first game back. So we'll see what that looks like, but just overall, Portland has, like I said, been super impressive. I mean, defensively, they're fifth in defensive rating, which kind of makes up for offensively, right? They're not that great. They're 13th, so they've been above average offensively, but clearly the defense is way ahead of, the offense, which is what you expected, right? That was kind of the question that we had about Portland was how are they going to get offense going, especially with Scoot being out. But, defensively, they've been great. A lot of contributions. And then from the Nuggets perspective, kind of a blown game, right? Where it's like, if you're the Nuggets, you've had two games, right? Where you had an opportunity to win both of those games and you couldn't close them out, right? They're 3-2. It could have been 5-1. But they were not able to get, the production that they needed to get at the end of the game. Jokic just not shooting the ball, interestingly enough, right? Only 10 shot attempts, but had 21, 14, and 9. Gordon, right? Kind of, he'd had 50 in the first game, right? And since then has kind of normalized back to regular human being levels,
Mm-hmm.
right? Cam Johnson was okay. Then Peyton Watson, 10 points, 4 rebounds, 2 steals. Like the bench had some tough moments in this game, but Valanciunas, I guess, is a backup big, but just a weird game overall. And like I said, I know most of the attention is going to be on the officiating. Christian Brown, I think, is kind of the one that's really the bummer because he just got his new contract, and so far he's been to me kind of a disappointment in most of the games he's played. Right, just this game 2 for 6, 0 for 3 from 3. In that Warriors game, he had some problems defensively, chasing stuff around, which again, I mean, a lot of teams have that and players have that issue. But, for a guy where I think most people like a lot, and he just got, obviously, the contract doesn't kick in until next season, but just feels kind of like a disappointment. Again, it's the first few games of the season, so, maybe these guys will figure stuff out. But the main story is Portland, being a revelation this season where, you kind of feel like, hey, if the defense holds and, Scoot comes back and the offense, doesn't completely tank, they have a real chance to at least, be a play-in team. I don't know necessarily if I can bank on them being a top 6 seed in the Western Conference. That's probably a little bit of a stretch,
Yeah.
but team is good. Like this feels like a good team where, if things work out, they might have a chance to, be in the play-in and get a top 8 spot. I'd be curious to see what that looks like because they've been really impressive. And that's kind of like the Bulls where they had a strong second half to last season, and you're kind of wondering, is this real? Is it not? So far, might just be real.
Yeah, shout out to Portland. I mean, if you look at that starting five, it's scary, what they can bring on the defensive end, right? Like everybody on that, roster can pretty much hold their own defensively, right? Like you already talked about it. Tamani Kamara, insane defensively. You pair that with Avdia as well, who can also hold his own defensively. Klingon, holding the back line. Drew, pretty much harassing everybody on the perimeter. The only guy that I'm kind of iffy on right now is Shaedon Sharpe because it seems like on a nightly basis, like you kind of don't know what you're getting from him. You might have an explosion where, he has a game like this where it's like, okay, a nice little calm 20 points on 50% shooting. But then other times you might get like, okay, he has like 12 points, but then it's like, oh, well, wow. Yeah, maybe that's not such a good stat line, right? The efficiency might be, super down. So I am curious what they do going forward, right? Do they swap him out, for somebody else, in the starting lineup potentially down the line? But regardless, right, like they're still on a 4-2 start, which is phenomenal. I don't think people really expected that, right? And I think that kind of is a testament to how important defense is, right? Especially in the league in today's day and age, right? Like, Offensively, if they can kind of figure some stuff out, I think that could put them in a whole different stratosphere. But do I expect that this season? Maybe not. I probably expect some individual guys to figure it out. Like Avdia is kind of building on the season that he had last year, right? Where it seems like he's figured things out offensively in terms of the pace, right? And what his role is being kind of like a point forward or like a guy who can play 1 through 4 pretty much. So it's pretty cool, to see the progression of this team. But offensively, I think they do have some struggles that they do need to figure out. But regardless, their defense is going to take them very far. I think this is similar to, what we've seen from, teams like Orlando in previous years, right? Where, their defense is pretty much going to guarantee them a spot in the playoffs.
Yeah, for sure. And that's really cool. I mean, in the Tiago Splitter era, I guess they're 4-1, right? So that's not nothing. I mean,
Yeah,
that's really
it's real.
impressive, especially considering where it felt like a low point, with the previous, allegations with the poker stuff. So
Yeah.
we'll see what happens there, but really cool, honestly. And then Pelicans Clippers, right? This was a game where, kind of went down to the wire. I mean, basically a game winner from Kawhi Leonard, right? The Pelicans were in and out of this game multiple times where it's like, oh, they might have a chance to take this game.
Sure.
Oh, and maybe not. And then they tie it up with the Zion free throws, and then Kawhi just comes in and just hits a great shot. 34 points, 5 rebounds, 5 assists, 6 steals. That's the thing with, Kawhi, where, kind of got off to a slow start to begin the season, but he's gotten progressively better and better, which they're going to need. Bradley Beal came back, only played 20 minutes, right? And that's kind of one of the things with them where, they traded away Norman Powell and basically looked at Bradley Beal as a replacement, but he hasn't really played a whole lot. And that's something where, like, offensively, if he could actually be healthy and play, then that would probably help them out because they turn the ball over a lot because they don't really have a lot of offensive, creators that they can really turn to, right? Because when Kawhi was out last year, it was Harden, Norman Powell, and Zubac that were holding it down on the offensive end in that starting group. But that, they haven't been able to turn to that this year. So if he can continue to be healthy, that will help. Chris Paul, I don't know, might just be done. Just because he hasn't really been that great in the games he's played. I guess he was -1 in this game, in a game in which they won by 2. So I guess net neutral, I suppose, but only 8 minutes played. So it feels like, Lou might be starting to kind of figure out what to do with some of these guys. John Collins comes off the bench. This was a game where, like, the Pelicans were 0-4 going into this game, by the way. So it almost felt like if you're the Clippers, who've had kind of a weird, wonky start to this season, it'd be like, of course, this team is the team that gives the Pelicans their first win of the season. But, Kawhi said no. So great from him. I'm
Sure.
Yeah, I'm curious to see, where do they go from here? Because it's been really weird. Like, it's kind of hard for me to, like, hunker down on what this team actually is, because when you watch them at different points, it's like, wow, there's stretches where they look kind of rough in terms of, like, with a lot of older players, some slower players in terms of who's playing together. Like, that Warriors game was bad, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that was the game where, like, that's kind of like what you mentioned, like the worst version of the Knicks against the Bulls. That was like the worst version of the Clippers, where they're just turning the ball over, they can't score, they're getting lit up on defense, and it wasn't good. And this game, I guess, was better, but I don't feel like I've seen enough to make me, like, still feel strongly about them as a really good team. I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt where Beal, hopefully, if he can be healthier, he can help juice up the offense and make them a little bit more dynamic. Maybe they start John Collins. I don't know, but this was a team I picked under on, by the way, because I just didn't buy it. But it's only 5 games, but I'm still not quite sure what to make of it. So maybe they can make a trade or something like that. Maybe they'll just figure out which guys can and can't play with one another. Because if you're Chris Paul, it probably doesn't help to also put him with Brook Lopez,
right?
Just because they're 2 older, slower guys, right? Where you probably want to balance that out with a little bit more athleticism. So maybe they'll figure that part out. And then for the Pelicans, they might just be cursed. Like, it's bad out here. They're 0-5, as we talked about going into the season. Why did you guys do this? You gave away an unprotected first. You're the only, well, no, not the only winless team, but they don't have a win. So that's a problem where, it's going to be pretty hard to bounce back, because if I'm not mistaken, no team that has gone 0-6, so they got one more game. If no team has gone 0-6 and made the postseason, because that's a lot of ground to cover, because that means you got to win 6 games in a row just to get to 500. And by that point, there's going to be teams that will still be ahead of you. And you're going to have to hope and pray that maybe some injury luck comes around. But just, I don't know. Then there's the articles from Clutch Points, I think Brett Siegel, where they're talking about like Willie Green's probably going to get canned, which, I mean, I guess I can't really blame. I mean, he's had a couple of decent seasons for them, but it's been up and down for them.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there was a game where I watched them against the Nuggets and DeAndre Jordan was the starting center, and I didn't quite understand that.
Yeah.
They were only down 4 at halftime, and then I switched to a different game. Then I come back to it, and they're down like 40 points in the span of like 15 minutes.
Yeah.
So I don't know what happened there. Fears is now, I guess, one of the bright spots is I do think Jeremiah Fears, he didn't shoot well in this game, but he's been good for them. So I think that's a bright spot where, that was a guy where I think, we both liked him, but we were like, we don't know about the fit on this team, right? Poole's now moved into the 6-man role, still at 30. So that's perfectly fine for him. And Fears is out there, 2 of 5 from 3. So I do like him. But this combination of guys is just very strange. I mean, Zion at 29, I don't know. The article kind of mentioned that he's kind of been floating around, right? And actually has been talking more so to Borrego as opposed to Willie Green. So we'll see how much truth there is. Queen, it's been okay. I mean, he only played 12 minutes in this game, but for a guy that you gave up an unprotected first for, I feel like it would be nice for him to be a little bit better.
I agree.
Maybe that's that's me being,
I agree.
Too critical, but just as a whole, I don't know. Like I said, I like some of that was the concern that we had, where it's like there's a lot of individual players and pieces that we like, but they don't really feel like they fit together.
No.
They can't get stops. I mean, every time they would get kind of close, I mean, boom, it's a Harden bucket where he blows past Zion or hits a step back 3 on somebody, or Kawhi. Just, I mean, that's what those guys do. But it just looked very easy for those guys. I mean, Kawhi had 34 and 16 shots. So, I mean, we've seen him be able to do stuff like that. But it was just kind of they've been, obviously, when you're 0-5, like, you're beyond disappointing. But it's pretty dark for them now because, at a certain point, if you lose a couple more games, like, that's probably it. I know they had that one season where they were like 1-10 or something like that, and then they ended up making the playoffs, and then with Zion not even playing. But this Western Conference is tricky because it is really tough, and there's some other teams that have been a little bit underwhelming, but I think they can be better. And for the Pelicans, like, DeJounte Murray's not coming back anytime soon. That's a guy that you're kind of waiting on, and I don't know. It's tough. Like I said, I don't know what to make of the Clippers necessarily. But in terms of the Pelicans, they might just be cooked. Yeah. I think that one might be a little bit more definitive.
Yeah, for sure. And I do want to go back to the Clippers for a little bit because I really do like this team on paper. I love it, right? Like the having Kawhi spearhead your offense, right? And then James Harden as well. I know a little bit past his prime, but it's a different version of James Harden, right? This is a guy where we know he's one of the best facilitators in the league, right? And then you have Zubac as well. Underrated big man. Everybody loves this guy, right? So why can't they really put it together? And I think it does come back to, some of the things like, I'm not going to say Chris Paul in general, right? But, just the quality of the bench, it is kind of odd, right? And it does Bradley Beal even really fit on this team, right? I don't know. Like, there's so many questions that have come up, I think, through the first few games of the season, right, for the Clippers, right? It's, like you said, 5 games, very small sample size. But I think when you see more inconsistency than consistency, throughout 5 games, that's where it gets a little bit worrisome, right? Because you do like the addition of Brook Lopez. You do like the, in theory, addition of Chris Paul as well, right, to kind of command the bench. But I think, straight up, you got to put a wing in there. You got to put another wing in there. I think Bradley Beal, I'm not going to say, he's the problem, but there are times when I don't really understand why he's out there instead of a guy like potentially John Collins or even Batum, honestly, if I'm being real. There's just stretches where I'm like, okay, what is this team really doing? But shout out to Kawhi. Very good vintage performance. I think you can't really ask more from him in this situation. But in all honesty, shouldn't have been a close game. I know New Orleans has, some offensive firepower. Yes, there were guys that popped off, but in general, I think they should have headed this off immediately, and this should have been a blowout win for the Clippers. But for the Pelicans, I don't even know what to say. Like you said, they might be cursed. I don't know how you go through 2 generational talents and pretty much come away empty-handed, right? Like Zion, great. I think he's having like a solid season, but it's just clearly not enough, right? Especially when you're going into the season a little bit hurt, right? Like you don't have DeJounte Murray. Jordan Poole is kind of filling in here and there, a little inconsistent, right? Fears as well. Like I like Fears is good. I think he's proven
Right.
that through, the 5 games that he's played in, but with the other guys on this team, it's like you don't really have an elite big man. Like you said, DeAndre Jordan was starting at one point. I don't know what you do with this team, right? And not having the first round pick, and you're already 0-5, so that means you're pretty much playing this season for absolutely nothing. Like that pick is guaranteed going to a completely different team. So I don't know what to do if I was New Orleans, and I don't think there really is anything. You kind of just have to lose because you're not going to win games, clearly, not with the way that this roster is constructed, right? They don't have enough juice, especially on the defensive end. It's disgusting.
Yeah, that's the tough part. Yeah, because like I said, if you watch the game, the Clippers were basically getting anything they wanted, and
Yeah.
where's the help? Like, what help is coming? I guess Kevon Looney, I guess, could come in and maybe help as a big, right? It's wild because he was Iron Man for like several seasons, and then this first season where he leaves the Warriors, he's hurt and he hasn't played yet. Because I think that was the guy that probably would have been the starting center had he been healthy, and I think he could help somewhat. But is he going to be able to completely solve, and fix what is ailing New Orleans right now? I think that might be asking a little bit too much, given the caliber of player he is.
Yeah.
Like he's a solid player, but I don't know if he can change their prospects. Like, and I don't think they want to lose. It's just what can you really do? They don't have enough defense to be able to really close out these games because they've had a few games where they were right there and just could not close it out. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, the Spurs game, Wemby fouls out and they still can't get stops. So it doesn't matter. So, like the only way they can win is they'll probably just have to blow out, a team and basically just kind of have an offensive onslaught. But is that going to happen? I mean, I don't, that's kind of tough. So, and it's tough to just bank on being an offensive team
Mm-hmm.
only.
Yeah.
So, I don't really know what they can realistically do. So, this is kind of the worst case scenario where they're not just bad, but they're winless. And like you said, even if they were good, the pick doesn't go to them. But you could at least accept it if you're like a good team that could make the playoffs. But right now, that might be a stretch. The door may open a little bit for them because it is only 5 games in, but they're going to need a little bit of help to go their way. And there's a couple of teams where I don't think they're going to be able to pass them anyways. So,
Right.
we'll see what happens.
Right.
So after that, in terms of the cup, not really too many other things that we, need to address. The Hawks did play the Pacers without Trae Young. He was hurt and they didn't really miss a beat. So, they were able to kind of have a bounce back win because they've been kind of weird through the first, few games. They are 3-3. But do you want to address them at all? Because I know we kind of talked about them a little bit, but Nickeil Alexander-Walker filled in for Trae Young, and he had a bounce back Dyson Daniels game. But the defense, they were struggling in the first half, and then in the second half they were able to pull away. I mean, the Pacers are basically a skeleton squad at this point.
Yeah. I mean, I think with Atlanta, I feel like there's something that's not really clicking here, right? I don't really know what it is because defensively, right? Like they should be, elite in one of those teams where, yeah, it should be a lockdown, kind of similar to Portland, but I feel like we haven't really gotten that. So I don't really know what's going on with them.
Yeah, yeah. Johnson defensively, it doesn't feel like it's there.
I know, right?
Now.
And that was a surprise because I feel like he was so coveted last year because of the fact that this is a wing that has so much offensive potential, but also is a great lockdown defender, and we just haven't really seen that. It's weird. Even Ricochet, he's been okay on defense. Nothing to really like run home about though.
Yeah, so yeah, it's tough. We'll see what happens, but I don't know how long Trae Young will be out. I guess the hope is that like, okay, you may not have quite as much offense, but like you'll have some defense with Nickeil Alexander-Walker, so they should be okay on paper in theory.
Yeah.
Like just Jalen Johnson will probably have an upsized or upscaled role on offense, but then that means you're probably not going to get as much from him on defense.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll see. Like I still think that they will be good, but it's weird because it feels like the Hawks and the Magic have gotten off slow starts, but the Magic specifically have not been good at all. They're
Horrible.
2-4. They actually have a losing record, and that one's a major concern And we talked about them in the last episode where defensively it hasn't been great. And then even on offense, it's not really been amazing either. I mean, they beat Charlotte, whoopee. So I mean, they have, they don't have a crazy schedule coming up, but that one to me is kind of a concern where like, I took the over on that one. That one might just be wrong because I mean, of course, it's still early, so they could get to 50 wins, but I feel like if they were gonna be 50 wins, they would get off to a stronger start than what we've seen. But just what am I missing here? Because it feels like that they should be better. The 23rd on offense, and then defensively, they're 23rd. So bad on both ends of the floor. It feels like nothing's really helped, and it feels like bench wise, not great either. Not really getting anything from Isaac or any of these other pieces. So,
Yeah.
what do you think is ailing them?
I don't know. It's weird because like maybe there might just not be enough ball to go around on this team. And I know that might sound kind of weird, but I don't know how that would affect them defensively because I don't think, you slot in Desmond Bain and I don't think your team falls apart completely, right? Like, I don't think that's the case. But like offensively, I've been thoroughly disappointed with them because I expect them to kind of take some leaps there, but we haven't really seen anything. It's really been kind of reversion, right? Back to the old where it's like your turn, my turn, Paulo Franz, and then maybe some spots where Desmond Bain gets the ball. But yeah, I like you said, the bench has just been very, very awkward, right? Like Tyus Jones, I've been kind of disappointed with that addition. Like you said, Jonathan Isaac hasn't really given you much on either end of the floor. It's just weird. I don't know. I don't know really what to make of it. And I want to blame it on a slow start, but from what I've seen, and I know they're playing my Wizards tonight, so I can kind of, figure it out and, maybe dissect it a little bit better tonight. But from what I've seen, I have not been impressed with Paolo, and I think that might be the, the problem here. But who knows?
Right.
I don't want to.
Yeah,
I don't want to crap on him because I still
right,
like
right,
his
right.
game.
Yeah.
But we're seeing a version of him that I don't like. I'll just say that. I'll leave it
Yeah.
at that.
Oh yeah, because I know there's been discourse about comparing him to Josh Smith, if you remember that
Yeah.
name. I
Yeah.
know you do, but
Yes.
just but yeah, this season he's not shot the ball well at all, right? 23 points, 9 rebounds, 3 assists, 40 from the field, and 16% from three. So that both of those things are gonna happen. He minus 7.8 in terms of plus minus. So they're not good when he's out there. And that's got to change because even last year, right? Like they were minus zero point 0.5, and that's with all the injuries that they had.
Yeah.
So I think that you're kind of hitting at a good point where like if you get a better version of Paolo, you'll probably see a better version of this team.
Yes.
Because in the last game that I saw, he did kind of go back to a little bit more of a balanced game where it's like, all right, I'm gonna play some point forward. Like he had 9 rebounds, 9 assists. So if you can get that from him, that'll help. Because we kind of talked about like the ideal thing with getting a Desmond Bain is like you don't have to be in a spot where you have to hope and pray that Paolo can just hit any and every tough shot, where he's got a little bit more space to work with and some more opportunities to kind of move the ball around and get guys some really good looks. But the offense is ugly. Like it's not a fun watch if you've watched a Magic game so far, and that's something I'm kind of concerned about, right? Because I mean, we talked about that with Jamal Mosley for the last couple of seasons, and like you had an excuse of all the injuries last year, but they've been, I mean, Suggs is on a minutes restriction, but the injury situation is nowhere near where it was last year. So if they continue to struggle, that's going to be a red flag. Where I'm
I agree.
hopeful that it'll be resolved soon, but it's another team where like the Knicks, where I didn't really expect them to get off to a slow start. I kind of assumed that they'd be out of the gates, playing. Like, of course, there's always growing pains, but I just kind of assumed since there's still a bunch of guys from last year's roster that it wouldn't be that much of a struggle. But it clearly has, and
Yeah.
like if you're Memphis, you're feeling pretty good right now. I mean, well, how great can you feel? But like just in general, like you got Coward. You got KCP, who's been much better there than he was in Orlando. And it can't, like you said, it can't just be bringing in Desmond Bain or getting rid of KCP that makes the defense just fall off. Maybe if the offense is better, that'll help balance it out, where it's like, okay, now that they can score, they don't have to just, turn the ball over or,
Right.
be forced to get back on defense because they still play at, they're trying to kind of play a little bit faster. It just hasn't worked. So we'll see what that looks like. But Yeah, Paolo's gotten off to a bad start.
I
So I
agree. Yeah.
think if he plays better, that'll help. Will it solve everything? I don't know. They might just not be quite as good as maybe what we thought,
Yeah.
but it is
Seriously.
only 5 games.
Yeah.
Yeah, so uh I guess um do we want to talk about the Bucks again and kind of go back to them because they did play, Golden State where Giannis was out. So you kind of assumed that it was going to be kind of a rough game because, they've not been, historically great when Giannis doesn't play. But just look at all these contributions that they're getting, from all these guys where, all of a sudden Ryan Rollins, who as many people have pointed out, he was in that trade, that sent Jordan Poole over to the Wizards, right? That Chris Paul Poole trade. And all of a sudden, he comes here. Kevin Porter Jr. is hurt. I think he's going to be out for a while. And, he comes in and he gets the starting spot. And he's been great for them. And, like, when you watch them play, like, the case that Bucks fans made to us and others, right? Because we weren't the only ones who were kind of critical of, the team, what they were going to look like. But just in terms of watching them, like, yeah, they look faster. They look more athletic defensively. There's a lot more activity there. And and also you still get Giannis kind of just being able to bully his way and play some of the best basketball of anybody in this league, where he's playing at an MVP level. So a lot of contributions all around. Right, Turner as another athlete, shot blocking presence. Cole Anthony as a guy off the bench. So at the very least, through the first 5-6 games, you're kind of getting the potential best case scenario version of this team. And it's so far it's pretty cool. I'm curious to see if it's sustainable, just because we've talked about before where yeah, the first 5 games of a season can be one thing, but we don't necessarily know if it'll hold up. But I think there's at least a case to be made where, if you still have a healthy Giannis, like this team might just be better than I think what we probably thought.
Um, I'm gonna stand on the hill. I'm dying on it. I don't think this team is good. Like I think yeah, like it's great that Ryan Rollins is having a great season. Sure, I didn't see that coming. Neither did a lot of people, right? But at the end of the day, I don't think it's really gonna matter because come playoff time, what is this team gonna look like? Regular season, they may be okay. Even though I don't believe in it. I'm sorry, I don't. I'm not buying it. I think we're gonna probably get some stinky stretches from Kuzma, probably Ryan Rollins as well, Gary Trent. Like, I just don't have a whole lot of belief in that team. I believe in Giannis, always will, always have been. I believe in Miles Turner as well, but outside of that, I don't know. But you do have to credit them. Like you said, they have had some great, by committee wins, especially, the one without Giannis. And then when Giannis is on the floor, yeah, these guys are knocking down shots, and that's pretty much all you could really ask for. But I don't think it's real.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess if we want to move over to Golden State, right? This was kind of a weird game for them. I mean, of course, you can chalk it up to, well, one of those trap games, right? Where it's like your other team's best player is out. You're kind of probably going in expecting to not have to do as much in order to get a win. And, then the other team just puts it on them. And, this kind of happened a little bit. It was much more pronounced in the Portland game where it's just kind of a weird, tricky team to play against where there's a decent amount of size. Well, I mean, the Bucks are kind of small without Giannis, but like you do have some athletes, you do have some length to kind of pester some of these guys. And for the Warriors, it's going to be interesting because they do have we've talked, because for the last few seasons, they have had like a tough schedule to begin the season where we're going to kind of get to see them play some really good teams early and kind of get an opportunity to see, how good this team, really is going to be, right? Because obviously they're 4-2, so it's not like they're bad at all. But, you do kind of look at a couple of their games where you do kind of wonder how sustainable is it going to be with the way Kuminga's played. He's played great. By the way, Horford's been really pretty rough in the last few games, and now they're kind of going back to like they're starting Quentin Post, and Horford's kind of coming off the bench. I think Kerr mentioned that depending on the matchup, he might start either Pods or Post, right? Depending on the matchup, which is kind of interesting because I just don't think Post is a starter. But either way, what do you make? Because they will play the Pacers after this episode goes up. Then they'll play Phoenix, so they'll have like a stretch where they're going to be able to play some weak teams and get some wins. But they'll play Denver again. They'll play OKC. They'll play the Spurs. So there's going to be some opportunities there where we're going to get to see early on what it looks like. But Is there anything that kind of makes you, you know, pause at all, or is it just kind of you just chalk it up to just a weird, stupid game?
I think it was a weird, stupid game. I know Jimmy and Steph, like numbers wise, looked okay, but in my opinion, definitely not the best versions of them for sure. Kuminga played okay, but I think it's kind of the bench, right? I think you would kind of expect a little bit more from maybe a guy like Pods, maybe a little bit more from even Al Horford. I know it might be a little bit much to ask at his age, but Moses Moody, I mean, kind of rotations weird. I think Kerr, not playing Moses Moody as much, or maybe relying on some other guys a little bit too much. I don't know, but I would say more of a weird game, especially since your superstars didn't really perform that well. And I think when Ryan Rollins is the best player on the floor, that's a problem.
Yeah, and that's the question I asked, because it does feel like defensively there's been, I don't know, just kind of some
Sure.
not great stretches for them where it does feel like some of these teams can kind of just run up and down the floor, but that's kind of part of the tough part of the regular season.
They're
Like,
old.
there's going to be Yeah, exactly. That's the tricky part of the regular season, where there's going to be games and teams where they'll just be able to run up, on the floor on them, and they're not going to be able to get as many stops. But the Horford thing, what do you think? Because it felt like in the first couple of games we saw some really good play from him, and he's not been as good as of late. Is he hurt? Do you think he might not quite be as good as maybe we thought, or is it just too early to really gauge?
Yeah, I think it's too early to gauge.
Mhm.
That's kind of how
Yeah.
I feel about it.
Yeah, fair enough. So, are there any other teams that you're kind of looking at where they're kind of catching your eye in terms of how we've seen them play? Because there is, one team that I guess I would ask about is the Wolves, because obviously they're going to be without Ant for, they've been without Ant for a couple of games. Still, I think supposed to be out for a couple more, and it feels like Minnesota defensively, to begin the season has been pretty rough, right? Where I mean, we watched, what they looked like against the Lakers, and they're 27th in defensive rating. And they're 18th in offense. Only 5 games. Ant's missed a couple games, so obviously he's pretty crucial and important to the team because he's their best player. But it just feels a little bit concerning, just because when I've watched them, it still feels like that, their young guys don't really jump off the page as of right now. Like Dillingham was kind of forced into playing because Ant's out, and he was solid, right, in the minutes he played. But most of the young guys, haven't really played a ton, and when they've played, they really just haven't been that great. So it's kind of just been the other guys kind of picking up the slack, and Conley and Gobert definitely feel like they're worse, right? Which I guess is kind of expected just because of the age. But they need the other guys to kind of be ready to step up and play. I know that sounds kind of cliche, but just it's concerning. But it's still early. But I think the hope was, okay, you lost Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Conley and Gobert will be a year older, but you have other guys that can come in and kind of fill the gaps. And I don't really feel like we're seeing that right now. Now, I mean, they did come back, and nearly steal the Laker game, but probably shouldn't have been down by 20 in the first place. Because, I mean, look at who was out there, for the Lakers, right? Like Jake LaRavia basically led both teams in points. Or I guess Randall had 30, but still, like, just the way that they were defending for most of that game was pretty concerning. I guess a positive is McDaniels offensively has been really good. They've given him more opportunities to work with, and that's always a plus because, if he can be a consistent offensive contributor, that will help them. But just overall, I haven't liked much of what I've seen from them, and that could just be a function of Ant being out.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, right? Like even with Ant though, they were still a little underwhelming, right? Like his performances were great, right? But like you said, Mike Conley looks like he probably shouldn't even really be in the league. Gobert looks, mid at best, and the other guys, right? Like DiVincenzo, I think he had a good game against the Lakers, but even then, it's like before that, the point guard experiment definitely did not go, I think, their way, right? Naz Reid, weird game in the Lakers one as well. So I think there are guys who have been definitely underperforming, but we kind of have to circle back to like, what we were talking about a couple episodes ago. Where's Rob Dillingham? Where's the development from him? Where's, the development from Terrence Shannon Jr.? Those were supposed to be the gap fillers, right? Like a Nickeil Alexander-Walker goes away, and Mike Conley, also seems like he's regressing a lot, right? It's time for those guys to step up, but we haven't really seen a whole lot of it. And I think that's disappointing because it can't, everything can't be contingent on, Ant-Man's development. He's already so good. Where are the other developmental pieces, right? And it even goes back to, when we started this podcast, right? Jay McDaniels, we already knew he was great defensively, but we need to still see him take, some multiple leaps on the offensive end. It's always it's a team effort here, and I just don't think there's been enough focus on that. It really seems like it's been honed in on one person, and I don't think that's going to be the recipe for success for this team.
Yeah, yeah, that's kind of where I'm a little bit concerned. And then I guess just to close things out, just like a few teams where we just kind of asked, like, is it real? Is it sustainable? Like we kind of mentioned. So Rockets, number one in offensive rating, right? They're 2-2. They've won two in a row. What do you think based off of what you've seen, right? This is one of your teams. And so based off of what you've seen offensively from them, do you feel like it's real? Is it sustainable that they could be actually one of the best offensive teams in the league? Because of course you brought in Durant, who's still giving you his rock solid production as usual. But what do you think?
Well, you kind of have to break down the two teams that they won against, right? They won against Toronto, which is a team where we talked about it defensively. Yeah, probably a cakewalk. And then I think they also played Brooklyn, if I'm not mistaken. And we already know the situation over there, right? And you look at the teams that they lost to, right? They lost to, I believe it was Detroit and obviously Oklahoma City. The Oklahoma City game, that could have really gone either way, right? We already talked about that. One of the best openers we've ever seen. The Detroit game, yeah, I think that was a little bit more of the reality of this team, probably, alongside the Oklahoma City game, where offensively there's going to be some struggles just because you don't have that point guard. So I think these games were get right games, against Toronto and Brooklyn, right? Where you talked about it, you're getting a bunch from Kevin Durant, the normal, right? The expected. And then obviously the other guys are kind of filling in as they should be, right? Taking, being more efficient and, not having as much, offensive pressure as last year, right? Cool. I think that was to be expected. But I need to see a little bit more. It's been a 4-game sample size from them. I expect them to be good offensively, but looking at the 4 teams that they played, it's really been a split, I think, of two very good teams and maybe like, one bad one and then a mid team at best. So shout out to them for getting back on track, because it was concerning the fact that they started the season 0-2. Not ideal for, a potential championship contender and the one that I picked to go to the finals. But I think they're showing you the positives of having a guy like KD on the team alongside young guys who are developing offensively.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a good point where, like you said, the last couple of games they did play against some, underwhelming teams. So you do need to see more. But at the very least, like you said, I think that's a good point. Get back or get right games where it's like, okay, you had a couple of rough losses where you played well enough to win, but you couldn't close it out. So now you get an opportunity to play against some other teams where these are the teams you're supposed to beat, right? Like it would be more concerning if they lost to these teams than if they lost to the other two teams, because you could see losing Oklahoma City. Maybe not quite as much Detroit, like you said. That's kind of a more that kind of stinks one. But Brooklyn and Toronto, those are ones where it's like those are teams you should beat, and like if you want to be one of the higher seeds, which you need to be, then that's going to help you go a long way. And then, I guess another team, like I said, just kind of like little quick ones. The Miami Heat, 9th in offense, 3rd in defense, 3-2. They did lose to the Spurs, but even with some injuries early on, are the Miami Heat actually a good team? This is a team that we picked the over on, with the addition of Norman Powell. But what do you think?
I'll say in this Eastern Conference, yes. I think they're a real team, right? I think, you look at the teams that they beat, right? They beat Memphis, they beat New York, they beat Charlotte. They lost to San Antonio and Orlando. I think the Orlando one was a little bit of an odd game for them. Granted, I think that was their first game. Spurs, I think we expected them to lose that one, right? Because San Antonio's been exactly, and San Antonio's been on freaking fire. But in the games they've won, they played some pretty good ball, right? You've gotten a lot, from multiple guys who I think, I'm not going to say were written off, but a lot of guys who might have been, perceived as a little bit overrated. But You're getting a good version of Wiggins. You're getting a good version of Bam. Kelly Ware has been solid as well. Davion Mitchell, we know what he brings, on the defensive end, right? So, and you're getting some bounce back performances from Jaquez, right? Who was a guy who we were like, okay, I don't know what happened to that guy last year. But overall, I think you're seeing the depth is there for sure. And especially in an Eastern Conference like this, it wouldn't surprise me if they're like a 4 or 5 seed and, get out of the first round somehow.
Yeah, Simone Fontecchio,
Yeah.
like you said, kind of coming in from Detroit, helping him out. And the Bam one is kind of wild, right? Because that was a guy where, not that we were obviously out on Bam, but I think there were legitimate questions of like, okay, offensively, can he actually be better than what we had seen the last couple of
Mm-hmm.
seasons, right? Yeah. And then this season, now he's shooting even more threes, right? He's only 43 from the field, but 36% from 3 on 7 attempts a game. Like you'll take that, right?
Yeah,
You'll take
absolutely.
that. He's shooting almost 90% on free throws. Playmaking's a little bit different, but you do have, Norman Powell out there, and it's a little bit of a different team. But if you can get Hero to come back and you can kind of figure out, how to balance out, him and Powell, and also Mitchell because he needs to play as well along with these other guys. Like, yeah, there's some really good opportunities, like you said in the Eastern Conference for them to be good. I don't necessarily know if I would say they're, what did we say they were offensively, like third or fourth? I don't necessarily know if they're that level offensively, but I think there's at least enough there to say like, oh yeah, this team is probably better than what it was on the offensive end than last year, especially if they could be fully healthy. Right? They were ninth. And they were third on defense.
Yeah.
That's what it is. So
Yeah.
defensively, they've been top 10 for a while. So that's kind of something we expect. It's been the offensive end of the floor that's been a major improvement for them. And that was kind of one of the things that we talked about where, the Powell addition, if he's healthy, he can give them some downhill juice. You've even got some good productions from Wiggins. And that's kind of the other piece, right? Because he was kind of in trade rumors, but if they keep winning games, he'll probably just stick around. So, it may not be as dire of a situation as it was for them, but we'll have to keep watching and see.
Yeah.
And then one last one. This one is a little bit different, but the Pistons, right, where we kind of talked about them, right, where they're, through the first few games, they're 3-2. They just won their last game against the Orlando Magic, and that was a game where they destroyed the Magic in that one, right? Where the Magic have been really struggling, and you got some really good production from a number of players, right? Like Cade Cunningham, 30-10, right? That's a guy where now he's one of those guys. Jalen Duren with a double-double, 21-13, and they're still without Jaden Ivey. So is there another level this team can reach? Because this was a team where I think we kind of expected them to take a step back with the loss of the veterans and then the introduction of some more young players.
Yeah, I mean, Detroit is interesting. I think they're definitely one to watch for sure. I think a cool part of their roster is like Cade. I feel like has been arguably better than last year, especially defensively. So I've been kind of thoroughly impressed with him, getting some fantastic stops on the defensive end, right? And using, his big body, to kind of annoy people. And I think that's the identity of this team, and that's what it should be. It should be, smash mouth basketball. They should be technically, in my opinion, the Houston Rockets of the Eastern Conference, where they kind of just bully you night in, night out defensively. But there are some clear limitations in that, right? Like you talk about Jalen Duren, where it's like defensively, what does he really look like by the end of the season, right? So I am curious about them. They're definitely one of those teams where they're one to watch, but I do kind of just expect some small little step backs, but we'll see what happens.
And as people have talked about, that's a team that could be the marketing destination if he gets traded.
Very true.
So we don't know if that'll happen, but they're a team to watch out for because they do have some pieces that they could, move in a trade. Like if they win a bunch of games without Ivy, I could see him being, a piece of a trade. I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen, but I could see them having that mindset because, they are kind of a team where it's like, they're not probably quite in the tier of, the upper tier teams in the East, but they're a team where like they're probably ready to start taking a step forward, but you don't want to rush it and make a bad move. You do kind of want to see what you got, but I could see them if he's out there or if somebody else is out there, they could be one of those teams that could try to approach
For sure.
one of these other guys.
For sure.
Yeah, so that pretty much concludes today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts in the comments about the Cup games you've seen so far, teams you like, teams you don't like. And if you want, leave the comments on at the OBT podcast on any of our socials or our videos, and continue to like and subscribe to help the channel grow. So we appreciate all of that. We'll see you next episode.